The door handle shook first, a faint metallic rattle that didn't belong in the silence of that night. It was the year 1847, deep in a territory where the laws meant nothing if a man was rich enough, cruel enough, and confident enough to believe that no one would ever question him. Inside the locked room, two sisters crouched on the cold floor, their bare feet pressed against the dirt, their fingers laced together so tight their knuckles turned white. The older one tried to steady her breathing, but each inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. The younger one trembled uncontrollably, her small frame shaking with terror she couldn't hide or swallow. The room smelled of damp wood and old sweat, a smell they had grown sick of in the days since they were dragged into this house and told they were now labor girls. But this room wasn't for labor. There was nothing inside it that could be used for work. No tools, no supplies, no materials. Only walls, a bucket, the cold ground, and a door that locked from the outside. The footsteps came next. Slow, even, and deliberate. Each one carried the weight of a man who believed everything behind that door belonged to him. The floorboards creaked as he approached, and the sisters' hearts thudded so violently they were sure he could hear them. They pressed farther back into the corner, though they had already reached the wall. The older sister whispered something, not to comfort but to prepare, because both of them knew what that sound meant. Every night he came. Every night he took his time. Every night he reminded them of the reality they had been forced into. They had come from a quiet village miles away, a place where their lives had been simple despite the poverty. They spent their days helping their mother grind grain, collecting water from the stream, laughing at the same small jokes they had shared since childhood. But poverty made families vulnerable, and raiders always knew where to find the vulnerable. The sisters had been taken quickly, in the confusion of smoke and shouting. They barely had time to scream before they were thrown onto a wagon and sold at a trading post that reeked of fear and desperation. The man who bought them barely looked at their hands or their bodies the way other buyers did when selecting workers. He didn't check their strength or ask about their skills. He only stared at their faces, their age, their terror. His gaze lingered in a way that made even the traders uneasy. Then he paid in full. A short exchange. A quiet agreement. The beginning of their nightmare. Now here he was again, on the other side of the door, the one deciding whether they lived, suffered, or died. The metal lock slid slowly. Not fast. Not efficient. Slowly, as if he enjoyed the suspense. The sisters held their breath. Even their tears refused to fall, afraid of drawing attention. The lock finished clicking open, and silence filled the hallway. No talking. No muttering. Just that heavy, terrible waiting. The door creaked open by an inch, letting a thin line of dim hallway light spill into the dark room. The sisters didn't move. They didn't blink. They didn't breathe. The older sister felt the younger one's nails digging into her arm, but she didn't tell her to stop. Pain was grounding. Pain meant they were still alive. Pain was something they could understand in a place where nothing made sense anymore. The shadow entered before the man did. Long and distorted, it stretched across the floor, reaching toward them like a living thing. The older sister's pulse pounded in her throat. The younger one whimpered under her breath, the sound barely audible but undeniably real. The man stepped halfway inside, his boots scraping against the wooden threshold. He paused there, as if savoring the moment, as if feeding off the fear that filled the room so thick it was almost suffocating. His breathing was steady, controlled, patient. He always took his time, because in his mind, time belonged to him. Their time. Their lives. Their bodies. Outside, the night insects went silent, as if even they understood what kind of darkness lived here. The air turned cold. The house felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sisters stared at the half-open door, at the silhouette standing in it, at the hand still gripping the handle. For a moment, a long, stretched-out moment, everything paused in perfect stillness, caught between terror and fate. And in that suspended second, before the man moved, before he stepped fully into the room, before he reached for them yet again, something shifted inside the older sister. Something quiet but solid. A spark that fear couldn't erase. The moment hung there, frozen in the dark history of that year, suspended between horror and the unthinkable decision that would soon follow. It was the last quiet breath before everything changed. They had not always lived in darkness. Long before the locked room, long before the trembling door handle, long before the year 1847 carved its cruelty into their lives, the sisters were known in their village as two inseparable shadows of the same light. The older one, Amma, carried a quiet strength that showed even in her childhood. She would wake before dawn to sweep the compound, help their mother grind millet, and carry water jars heavier than her arms should have managed. The younger sister, Efua, followed everywhere, talking too much, laughing too loudly, always stepping on Amma's heels because she never liked being more than a few inches away from her. Their home was small, made of mud walls and a thatched roof that leaked when it rained too hard, but it was full of warmth. Their father was a hunter who left for days at a time but always returned with stories that made Efua squeal and Amma roll her eyes while still smiling. Their mother kept a tiny garden behind the house, growing vegetables no one else bothered with, telling her daughters that even poor soil could surprise you if you cared for it long enough. Poverty lived with them every day, sitting at the same table, stretching thin meals across too many nights, but it never took away their closeness or the comfort they found in each other. Amma grew into a young woman with discipline in her posture and calm in her voice. Efua grew into a girl who still clung to her sister's arm when she was scared, still hid behind her during storms, still trusted her completely. Their bond became the one thing everyone in the village noticed first. Neighbors would joke that if you wanted to speak to one, you might as well speak to both, because where Amma stood, Efua was already leaning against her. But the world outside their village was shifting. Slave raiders had begun pushing farther into isolated regions, fueled by rising demand in territories hungry for labor they did not intend to pay for. Stories spread of girls disappearing, of families torn apart in a matter of minutes, of children sold in the night and swallowed by distant lands that treated them as property. The elders warned everyone to stay close to home. Hunters traveled in pairs. Mothers kept their children indoors longer. But warnings were just words. Hunger was real. Poverty was a trap. And in years like those, vulnerability spread through poor villages like smoke through dry grass. Amma and Efua's family struggled like everyone else. Their father's hunting brought in less food as wild animals grew scarce from overhunting. Their mother fell ill one season, leaving the three of them to work twice as hard for half as much. The sisters learned early how to carry burdens bigger than their bodies. They fetched water, gathered firewood, pounded grain, and still found time to tease each other, to laugh over burnt porridge, to dance barefoot around the courtyard whenever their father played his old flute. They knew nothing of the world's cruelty until the morning it arrived at their door. It started with distant screaming, sharp, panicked, too close. Amma pulled Efua behind her before they even understood what was happening. Men with guns and ropes stormed into the village, dragging people from their homes, smashing anything in their way, moving with the ruthless precision of predators who had done this many times before. Amma tried to run with her sister, but there was nowhere to go. Shadows moved faster than fear. Efua cried out for their mother. Amma clutched her hand so tightly it hurt. But strength could not outmatch armed men trained to take whatever they wanted. The sisters were pulled apart for a heartbeat, just long enough for terror to break through, but Amma fought with a desperation no one had seen in her before. She kicked, tore at hands, clawed her way back to Efua, and wrapped her arms around her. The raiders found amusement in her courage, not threat. They bound both of them together with coarse rope and tossed them onto a wagon already filled with terrified captives. Their parents' voices reached them briefly through the chaos, but the distance grew quickly, and soon the only sound was the grinding wheels carrying them away from everything they had ever known. The world they entered now was ruled by men who saw value only in bodies, not in lives. Markets swelled with buyers who viewed human beings as inventory. Girls fetched the highest prices, especially those young enough to obey and old enough to endure. The sisters held each other the entire journey, their wrists bruised from ropes, their tears mixing with dust on their faces. Amma whispered every comforting lie she could think of, promising they would be returned home, that someone would save them, that this nightmare was temporary. Efua believed her because she needed to. Amma forced herself to believe her own lies because she had no other choice. This was the world that shaped their fate. An era where desperation turned families into targets, where greed grew faster than compassion, where the powerful devoured the powerless without remorse. The sisters had been raised on the idea that goodness could protect them. But the year 1847 cared little for goodness. It cared only for what could be bought, taken, or broken. And long before they arrived at the estate where their story would twist into something the world had never seen before, Amma and Efua already understood one thing. Survival would depend on each other, or not at all. The raiders came like a storm, sudden and unrelenting. The morning had been quiet, with only the usual sounds of the village waking up to another day of struggle, but by mid-morning, that silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves and the sharp crack of whips. They appeared from behind a bend in the road, armed men riding on horseback, their eyes cold with the kind of violence that didn't hesitate. The people of the village scattered, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The land was flat, exposed, and the raiders knew it. Amma was the first to see them, her eyes wide with alarm as she turned toward Efua, who was still in the garden, bent over the flowers their mother had planted. Amma shouted for her to run, but it was too late. Before they could react, the men had already reached them, grabbing them roughly by their arms. The raiders weren't gentle. They didn't ask for cooperation. They demanded compliance through violence, through terror, through force. The sisters were pulled apart in a heartbeat, torn from each other's grasp before they could even comprehend what was happening. Amma struggled against the man holding her, kicking and biting, trying to reach Efua, who was already being dragged away by another raider. But it was useless. The men were too strong, too fast. Amma's screams echoed in the air, but they were swallowed by the sound of hooves thundering through the dirt. The force of one raider's slap sent her sprawling, and for a moment, the world spun, everything blurry and chaotic. By the time she regained her senses, Efua was gone. The terror of being separated from her sister gripped her chest like a vice, but she was too stunned to move, to think, to fight. The sisters were forced onto the back of a cart, their wrists bound tightly with coarse rope, the rough fibers cutting into their skin. They were not alone. Around them, other captives sat in silence, their faces blank, eyes hollow, understanding all too well what was happening. The cart lurched forward, pulled by horses that moved at a pace too fast for any hope of escape. They passed through the village, the people watching from behind shuttered windows and doorways, too afraid to interfere. The sisters could hear the faint sounds of their mother's voice, desperate and frantic, calling for them from the distance, but there was nothing they could do. They were already beyond reach. The journey to the trade market was long and relentless. The sun beat down on them, unyielding, while the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The sisters barely spoke, though both of them could feel the weight of the other's fear, the quiet despair that filled the space between them. They had been torn from their world, from the only life they had ever known, and the future they had once imagined seemed to slip further away with every mile that passed beneath the cart. The road they traveled on was a brutal one, beaten down by years of use. There was no comfort, no respite. The raiders pushed them along, offering no food, no water, and no kindness. Every time the sisters tried to speak to each other, to offer the smallest word of comfort, the guards would bark at them to be silent, to stop crying, to stop struggling. The terror that had gripped them in the village now felt like a constant companion, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, gnawing at the edges of their minds. As the day dragged on, the market came into view. It was a sprawling, filthy place where men with bags of coins came to barter and trade human lives like cattle. The smells hit them first: rotting meat, sweat, the metallic tang of blood and fear in the air. The market itself was a blur of motion, a cacophony of voices shouting out deals, women and children being pushed into pens, men inspecting the merchandise with cold detachment. It was a place where dignity went to die, where innocence was stripped away in exchange for profit. The sisters were pushed into a cage, a holding pen that smelled of sweat and urine. The iron bars glinted in the sun, cold and indifferent. Around them, other young girls were already there, their eyes empty, their bodies trembling, their lives no longer their own. Amma could barely hold her composure. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of terror. What would happen to them? What would happen to Efua? But she couldn't cry. She couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not in front of these men. A man in a dark coat approached the cage, his eyes scanning the girls like one would scan merchandise. His gaze lingered on the sisters for a moment, measuring, assessing. He looked them up and down, his eyes cold and calculating. His hand reached into his pocket, pulling out a pouch of coins. He spoke briefly to the traders, and a deal was struck without a single word of empathy. The sisters were his now. His property. To do with as he pleased. The harsh reality set in like a physical blow. They had been bought. Bought to be worked, to be used, to be broken. Their lives no longer belonged to them, but to this man and whatever future he had planned for them. The world they knew, the world that once made sense, was gone. And they were nothing but a transaction in the eyes of those who held the power to shape their fates. Amma tried to keep her resolve, but it was fading, slipping through her fingers like sand. She reached for Efua, her sister's hand lost in the crowd. The pain of that loss cut deeper than any whip ever could. In that moment, they were both alone, swallowed by a world that didn't care, a world that saw only what could be taken. And so they stood there, silent and broken, waiting for the next step in their journey to unfold. The man who purchased the sisters was everything their captors wanted him to be: dignified, well-spoken, and polished in public. His appearance was always immaculate, his manners impeccable, and his reputation beyond reproach. He was known throughout the community as a man of wealth and influence, a respected businessman with a heart for charity and a keen interest in improving the lives of others. At least, that was the version of him that the world saw. But behind the carefully curated image was a man who reveled in the power he held over others. A man whose wealth allowed him to purchase whatever he desired, no matter the cost. And what he desired now were the two sisters, not as workers, but as objects he could possess and control. The whispers that followed him, always just out of earshot, always muted, told a different story. Those who worked in his household, who served him quietly and never questioned his authority, knew the truth. They spoke in hushed tones when he wasn't around, of how his need for dominance extended far beyond the walls of his estate. His reputation as a benevolent employer was a facade, a carefully maintained shield to protect the darkest parts of his soul. Some of his workers had seen the coldness in his eyes, the way he treated the women who served him, the way he never let them look him in the eye unless given permission. Others had heard the screams from the locked rooms at the back of his estate, muffled and distant, but unmistakably real. It was only when the sisters arrived that his true nature would fully emerge. When the sisters were led into his presence, they were terrified, unsure of what to expect from this man who had bought them. They had heard his voice but had not yet seen his face. He was a tall man, dressed in a fine suit, with a sharp jawline and cold eyes that betrayed no emotion. He looked at them not with any sense of sympathy or recognition, but with the detached assessment of a man choosing an investment, one that would pay off in ways the world would never see. He didn't need to know their names. He didn't need to care about their past. All he needed to know was that they were young, compliant, and at the mercy of his power. His inspection was clinical. His gaze traveled up and down their bodies with a cold, measuring precision. He made no comment, did not speak a word to them, but his eyes told them everything. He was calculating. He was assessing how they would fit into the roles he had already envisioned for them. They would be his property, and he would use them in whatever way he deemed necessary. His hand went to his pocket and he pulled out a purse of coins, exchanging it with the traders who had brought the girls to him. The transaction was smooth, swift, and without hesitation, confirming that this was not about labor but about ownership. The sisters had no voice in this deal. Their bodies had been bought, and soon, they would know exactly how little they mattered in the eyes of the man who had claimed them. When they were handed over to him, the world outside faded, and all that remained was the cold reality of their new life. They were taken to the estate, their eyes wide with confusion, their hearts pounding with fear. As they entered, the sense of dread grew heavier. The estate, at first glance, appeared to be a mansion of wealth and grandeur. But there was something about the place that felt wrong. The long, empty corridors, the heavy silence that enveloped the space, the distant sound of doors slamming shut, as if sealing them in. The estate itself was vast, its layout intricate and labyrinthine. The walls were lined with dark wood and heavy curtains that blocked out the sunlight, leaving the air thick with the musty scent of neglect. The house seemed to swallow the light, casting long shadows that made every corner feel like it was hiding something sinister. As the sisters were led deeper into the heart of the house, they were shown the servants' quarters, where they would sleep, their bodies bruised from the long journey. But it wasn't just the house that felt wrong, it was the guards. They stood at attention, their faces impassive, eyes trained forward, never meeting the sisters' gaze. There were more of them than the sisters had ever expected, each one stationed at key points, watching every movement. It was clear that no one left without permission, and that their every step would be monitored. The sisters were led to a room in the back of the estate, far from the main areas where the buyer entertained guests. It was a small, cramped space, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The walls were bare, save for the flickering light of a single candle. They were locked in, the heavy door clanging shut behind them, the sound echoing in the silence that followed. There was no window, no escape. Just four walls, a bed with thin sheets, and a bucket in the corner for waste. The door had been locked from the outside, and the key was kept with the guards. They were not to leave this room unless the man or his servants gave them permission. The sense of danger was immediate. The sisters looked at each other, their hearts heavy with the realization that this was no ordinary life of servitude. They were not here to work, not here to serve. They were here to be controlled, to be owned, to be used in ways they could never have imagined. There was no warmth in this place, no kindness. Only cold, calculated power. And as the door locked behind them, they understood, this was the beginning of their nightmare. For a brief moment, they held each other in silence, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on their shoulders. The house, once beautiful, now felt like a prison. The guards, once distant figures, now felt like hunters circling their prey. And outside their door, their new master waited, knowing full well that his control over them had just begun. This was not a life they had chosen. This was not a life they had wanted. But now, it was the only life they had. The first night in the estate was a turning point for the sisters. The sounds of the house creaked and groaned as if it too were mourning their arrival. The candle flickered weakly in the dim room, casting long shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to whisper of the horrors to come. They sat on the small, uncomfortable bed, pressed close together, afraid to speak, afraid to move. The silence was oppressive, filling every inch of the room, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. The buyer's voice had lingered in the air, cold and indifferent, as he gave his instructions to the servants before leaving them in the room. There was no warmth in his words, no attempt at kindness, only a firm command that they were to wait. He was a man of control, a man who thrived on power, and it was clear to the sisters that he would not hesitate to exert his dominance in ways they had not yet experienced. Hours passed, and the sisters barely slept, their bodies frozen in fear, their minds racing with confusion and helplessness. They could hear footsteps outside their door, the sound of the guards walking by, their boots heavy on the wooden floors. At one point, the lock rattled, and the door creaked open just enough for a brief moment before it was slammed shut again. There was no escape, no release, only the suffocating awareness that their fate was no longer in their hands. When the buyer finally returned, it was in the late hours of the night, after the house had gone quiet, when the air was thick with anticipation and dread. His presence in the room was felt before he even spoke. He stepped in, his gaze cold, his posture erect, and the sisters instinctively shrank away from him. His eyes swept over them, examining them like they were objects to be owned, to be molded. His gaze was calculating, detached, and in that moment, the sisters realized that their bodies were no longer their own. They were commodities, bought and paid for, and the buyer would use them however he saw fit. He stood there for a long moment, silent, watching them, allowing the weight of his presence to fill the space between them. There was no hesitation in his actions, no words of warning, just the cold, unyielding assertion of his control. He moved towards them slowly, deliberately, and with each step, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating. The sisters recoiled instinctively, but there was nowhere to retreat. The bed was too small, the walls too close, and they were trapped in this small, windowless room with a man who saw them not as people, but as tools, as objects to be used. The buyer did not speak, did not make any demands. His actions were simple, precise, and unrelenting. He made it clear that they were not allowed to resist, not allowed to fight back. His dominance was not physical, it was psychological. It was a slow, calculated destruction of their will, their sense of self, and their hope. The power he held over them was not in his strength, but in his complete control over their world. He was their captor, their owner, and every minute he spent in the room chipped away at whatever was left of their dignity. By the time he left, the sisters were shaken, broken in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. They lay still, their bodies frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to move. The room felt colder now, the silence louder. There was nothing but the sound of their own breathing, the heavy weight of what had just happened hanging over them like a suffocating fog. The hope that had lingered at the edges of their minds had been crushed. This was their new reality. The terror of their situation was too much to process at once, and in its place, something far darker began to take root, an acceptance that they had no power here, no voice. They were simply things, kept alive only as long as they served a purpose. But even in the deepest pit of despair, a flicker of something began to stir between them, a bond forged by the very trauma they had endured. The older sister, Amma, pulled her younger sister, Efua, closer, wrapping her arms around her protectively. Efua sobbed quietly, her body trembling, but she found solace in her sister's embrace. In that moment, they realized they had only each other. They had been torn from everything they knew, but their bond, silent, unspoken, remained. It was the only thing they could hold on to. As the hours passed, the sisters began to understand that survival in this place would not come from defiance, it would come from observation, from learning how to navigate this new world. They spent the next few days in silence, watching everything around them, learning the routines of the house, the guards, and the man who controlled their fate. They took note of the patterns, the times when the guards were less vigilant, the moments when the buyer would retreat into his office, leaving them alone for brief stretches of time. They watched how the other servants moved about the house, how they interacted with the buyer, how they avoided his gaze, how they spoke only when spoken to. This became their survival instinct. They couldn't fight him directly, at least not yet, but they could learn. They could observe. They could find small ways to take back control over their lives, even if it was just for a moment. The trauma they had experienced began to transform into something else. It was no longer just a victimhood. It was the spark of determination. Each piece of knowledge they gathered, each piece of power they could reclaim, became a small act of defiance. They would survive. Not by resisting immediately, not by throwing themselves against the walls of their prison, but by becoming invisible, by becoming like the shadows in the corners of the room, unseen, unnoticed, but watching, waiting. The bond between them grew stronger as they relied on each other for the emotional strength they had lost. Amma kept Efua calm when the terror of the unknown threatened to overwhelm them both. Efua, though frightened, clung to her sister, finding in her a source of protection that she couldn't find anywhere else. Together, they began to rebuild the foundation of their resistance, not through direct confrontation, but through quiet rebellion, through observation, through survival. As the days turned into weeks, their bond solidified into something unbreakable. No matter what horrors the buyer would impose upon them, no matter how much he would try to break them, the sisters knew one thing: they would never be completely lost as long as they had each other. And that, in the end, would be their greatest strength. In the weeks that followed, the estate's oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. What had started as an uncomfortable existence, a life reduced to fear and silence, began to unravel into something darker, more suffocating. The buyer, once a figure of detached control, slowly revealed the depths of his cruelty. His power over the sisters extended beyond the confines of their small, locked room. He grew more unpredictable, more violent. At times, he would appear at odd hours of the night, his eyes cold, his voice commanding, as if he were simply looking for a way to remind them who was in charge. His visits were no longer confined to just watching them or issuing commands. He would take his time in the room, standing just inches away, looming over them, inspecting them as though they were property to be appraised, not human beings with emotions or dignity. His presence, once a simple reminder of their captivity, had become a terrifying ordeal, something to be endured rather than lived through. The psychological toll on both sisters was beginning to show. He wasn't alone in his behavior. As time passed, other powerful men began to visit the estate. Men who shared his desires, who seemed to feed off his cruelty, and who came with the same cold detachment. They would sit in his study, drink wine, and laugh as the sisters were paraded before them like nothing more than curiosities to be inspected. The men never spoke to them directly. They never acknowledged their humanity. They simply observed, as if watching animals in a zoo. The men's visits were rare but frequent enough to deepen the terror in the sisters' hearts. One night, after a particularly violent encounter with the buyer, the sisters were forced to sit in front of him as a guest, a man whose name they would never know. He was older, with a cold smile that never reached his eyes, his fingers stained with ink as he examined papers, speaking casually as if the sisters weren't even in the room. The buyer, sitting beside him, made an offhand remark about how the sisters were good for work, but needed a little discipline. The guest laughed, a short, cruel chuckle, before making a crude joke about the buyer's acquisition. The sisters could feel their skin crawl, their stomachs churn, but they said nothing. They had learned by now that silence was the only protection they had left. That night, the buyer's cruelty escalated once again. It wasn't enough to punish them for imagined disobedience or to remind them of their place in the world. This time, the punishment was physical. He struck them both. It was swift, merciless, and brutal. The pain of the blows was sharp, but it was not the physical pain that would stay with them. It was the humiliation, the complete disregard for their personhood, that shattered any remaining sense of safety they had. They were nothing more than tools, objects to be used at his will, and he made sure they understood that in every violent gesture. That night, as the buyer left, the sisters were left alone, lying in silence. The room, once a place of uneasy stillness, now felt like a tomb. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on them, each breath a struggle, each thought a painful reminder of the brutality they were trapped in. But beneath the suffocating despair, something else began to stir, something that neither of them could ignore. It was a quiet, burning rage that started in their chests and spread outwards like a fire waiting to ignite. The younger sister, Efua, had been trembling ever since the first blow landed. She had always relied on Amma for strength, always looked to her older sister for protection. But this time, something in her snapped. The overwhelming sense of helplessness, the knowledge that no one would come to save them, had reached its limit. She couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the pain, the constant violation, it had broken her, and she was ready to act. Amma saw it in her eyes, that moment of finality. Efua, the one who had always been so terrified, had crossed the line from fear to something else. She was no longer just surviving. She was ready to fight. Amma felt her heart race as she realized the same thing was happening to her. She, too, could feel the anger rising, the resolve hardening in her chest. They had endured enough. They had been broken, humiliated, and controlled, but they were not finished. It was that night, in the depths of their shared suffering, that the sisters made a decision that would change everything. They would no longer accept their fate. They would no longer wait for their lives to be dictated by the whims of their captor. They had nothing left to lose. Either they would escape, or they would die trying. The fear that had once paralyzed them now became fuel for something stronger, something that drove them to take action. Amma, always the calm, strategic one, began to think of their options. She remembered the guards, their routines, the small gaps in the security of the estate. She remembered the broken door, the weak lock on the window. And she knew they could not escape in the traditional way, not yet. But they could wait. They could prepare. And when the time was right, they would strike. Efua, her body still trembling from the night's brutality, nodded silently. She would follow her sister, always her sister. But this time, they were no longer victims. They were fighters. And the first step toward freedom would be taken together. This was the moment. No longer would they sit in silence, accepting what they could not control. No longer would they wait for mercy that would never come. It was time to fight for their lives. The days that followed their decision to fight for their freedom were spent in the quietest of desperation. Every moment in the estate, every passing hour of silence, was now a calculated opportunity. The sisters no longer simply endured. They observed, they memorized, they planned. Every sound, every movement, every detail of the estate was catalogued in their minds. They learned the shift patterns of the guards, how some of them were more lenient, others more vigilant. The timing of their patrols, the creaking of the gates, the slamming of doors, all became part of their new reality. They noticed the weak spots. The lock on the back door that had been repaired half-heartedly. The window that had been cracked just enough to pry open if they could find the right tools. The way the floorboards creaked in the hallway outside their room, betraying the footsteps of anyone walking by. In the dark hours, when the estate was still and the guards were far, the sisters worked silently, gathering whatever they could find. Broken shards of metal from discarded furniture. A nail that could be twisted into a makeshift lock pick. Strips of cloth they could fashion into ropes. Everything had to be repurposed, reused. No tool could go to waste. They worked with the precision of a machine, moving in whispers, their fingers trembling, but their resolve steady. Their eyes locked onto one another, there was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. Amma took the lead, always the planner, always the one to calculate their next move. She meticulously measured the time between the guards' rotations, counting the seconds between their patrols. She knew that the smallest delay could destroy everything they had worked for, so she mapped out the exact window in which they would need to execute their plan. Efua, though younger and once the more fearful of the two, became the one to reinforce Amma's resolve. She was quick, clever, and her instincts for survival were sharper than Amma could have imagined. Together, they became a single force, silent, determined, and unstoppable. The sisters practiced with their makeshift weapons, testing the small tools they had fashioned from scraps. Amma used a piece of broken glass to cut through the rope, while Efua fashioned a sharp stone into a crude knife. These were not weapons meant for battle, they were tools of survival, tools to end this once and for all. When they finally had their plan set in motion, it was as if time itself had slowed. The night they had been preparing for arrived, and everything fell into place. The buyer's absence from the estate gave them the window they needed, but the guards were still around, still watching, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. At the exact moment they had planned, they moved, swift and silent. The sisters knew the layout of the house better than anyone, and they slipped through the dark corridors like shadows. Amma, holding the makeshift weapon in her hand, moved ahead, her movements calculated, her heart pounding in her chest. Efua, clutching the lock-pick, followed close behind, her breath shallow but steady. They reached the back door, the one with the faulty lock. The plan was simple: disable the lock, sneak through the kitchen, and reach the buyer's office, where they knew he kept the key to the outer gates. But nothing ever goes as planned. The door creaked louder than expected, the noise too sharp in the stillness of the night. The guard stationed outside the room turned, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Who's there?" he called. Amma's heart skipped a beat. In a split second, she launched forward, driving the glass shard into his throat with a precision that shocked even her. The guard's body went limp in her arms, his life draining out quickly onto the cold floor. Efua's eyes were wide with fear, but she did not hesitate. She helped Amma drag the body into a nearby closet, closing the door quietly behind them. Time was running out. They couldn't afford another mistake. They continued, faster now, toward the kitchen, toward their goal. But the estate was not as empty as they had thought. As they crept through the hallways, they saw the shadows of other guards moving in the distance. Amma's mind raced. They couldn't risk being caught. They couldn't risk failing now. They reached the buyer's office, where they found the key to the gates, hidden in the same drawer where the man kept his wealth. But the moment they grabbed it, they heard it. The distinct sound of boots hitting the floor. The guards were closing in. Without a word, they bolted toward the rear exit. They had no time to waste. As they reached the door, the final moment of the plan began to unfold. They could hear the voices of the other servants, the confused shouts of the guards, and the unmistakable sound of the buyer's voice, angry, panicked, but too late. The sisters had reached the gate. Amma fumbled with the key, her hands slick with sweat, her heart racing as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. The gate swung open with a screech that sent panic surging through their veins. They didn't wait. They didn't think. They ran. The air was cold against their skin as they sprinted across the grounds, their feet pounding against the earth. The sound of their flight was drowned out by the chaos behind them, but they didn't stop. They pushed forward, past the guards, past the servants, and towards the fence that would be their final barrier to freedom. They reached it. Amma grabbed the rusty metal bars, the sharp edges digging into her palms as she hoisted herself up. She barely made it over, the fear of being caught nearly too much to bear, but Efua was there, helping her down on the other side. But just as they thought they had escaped, a shout echoed from behind them. The guards were chasing them. The estate's walls were closing in. They didn't look back. Adrenaline coursing through their veins, they ran into the dark night, away from the horrors they had left behind. They ran toward a future that, for the first time in months, seemed possible. In the years following their escape, the fate of the two sisters became a subject of intense speculation, surrounded by conflicting reports and faded memories. Some said they were never found, that they had slipped away into the shadows of history, leaving no trace behind. In this version of their story, the sisters became ghosts, whispers on the wind, their names erased from all records as though they had never existed. This version gave the world the comfort of forgetting them, of believing that they had escaped, that they were free from the torment they had endured. But other accounts told a different story. Some claimed that the sisters had been captured, their brief moment of freedom snatched away by the very system they had fought to escape. According to these reports, they were brought back to the estate, broken and defeated, their rebellion crushed before it could spread beyond the walls. The details of their return were unclear. Some said they were punished in ways too terrible to speak of, while others suggested that the buyer, having regained control over them, disappeared them from history altogether. If they had been captured, it was as if they had never been anything but victims. Then, there were the testimonies from those who swore the sisters lived on, in secret, under new identities. These accounts were filled with mystery, each more fantastical than the last. Some claimed that the sisters found sanctuary in a distant land, far from the reach of the buyer's influence. Others believed they had disappeared into the underbelly of society, disguised as common workers, their names erased, their lives hidden in plain sight. To some, they became symbols of resilience, of women who refused to be defined by the brutality they had faced. They were no longer the slaves of their past. They were survivors, living on as something much more powerful than the world had ever allowed them to be. But the truth of what happened to the sisters after their escape remains elusive, buried beneath layers of speculation and fear. No one will ever truly know what became of them. Some say they died in obscurity. Others say they lived to be old women, never to speak of the horrors they had endured. But their story did not end with the bars of the estate. It lived on, in whispered rumors and half-remembered tales. It became a myth. A story told in hushed voices, a cautionary tale passed down from one generation to the next, a tale of strength and defiance in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Their legacy, whether lost to time or protected by it, became something more than just the story of two sisters. It became a reminder of how history often celebrates the powerful, those who leave marks on the world through dominance and control, while it forgets the ones who resist, the ones who refuse to submit. It is easy to write off the powerless as insignificant, to overlook the broken and the silenced. But in the end, it is the forgotten victims who shape the world in ways that history will never fully understand. As you reflect on their story, remember this. History does not always remember the ones who were strongest or most powerful. It remembers the ones who, in the face of unspeakable evil, refused to die quietly. Their courage, their bond, their fight, these are the things that change the world. These are the things that last. And perhaps, in the end, their greatest victory was that they were never truly forgotten. If you found this story powerful, if you believe the voices of those forgotten by history deserve to be heard, make sure to subscribe to keep uncovering the hidden truths of the past. Like this video if you were moved by their courage, and comment below with your thoughts. How do you think their story would have changed history if it had been known? Share this video with others who need to hear these untold stories and help keep their legacy alive.